The Shadow Clone Jutsu is one of the most overpowered techniques in the Naruto universe. It gives one the ability to overwhelm their opponents in battle and even condense years worth of training to just a few hours. It's a cheat code in the literal sense, but contrary to popular belief, it also nerfs Naruto in battle. You see, this jutsu was first introduced in chapter 1 of Naruto's manga, back when Naruto could barely perform the clone jutsu. This is important to note since there is a big distinction between the clone jutsu and the shadow clone jutsu. The first one, which also goes by the name Bunshin no Jutsu, simply creates a copy of a ninja without substance. It's more so an illusion that doesn't even produce a shadow, which can be used as a distraction. The Shadow Clone Jutsu, on the other hand, which by the way goes by the name Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, does create a copy that has substance, to the point of possessing bones, blood, and even equivalent chakra to the original. In fact, chakra being evenly distributed between these clones is one of the main benefits of the ability, since unlike the regular clone jutsu, not even the most powerful dojutsu in this universe has the ability to tell them apart from the original. Aside from Madara, of course, because, the mechanics of this universe simply doesn't apply to him. Now, what's funny about this is that Naruto gained the ability to use this jutsu after stealing the scroll of forbidden seals in chapter 1, yet for some reason, he was able to use it to defend Hinata in Naruto the Last when he was way younger. And no, this wasn't the clone jutsu. Naruto outright says Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, so a slight bit of continuity error there. With that said, there's one massive issue when it comes to the Shadow Clone, which is that some statements imply that Shadow Clones are weaker than the original, while in practice they don't appear to be. In fact, Shadow Clones being just as strong as the original is an opinion held by multiple reputable figures, including the unofficial Narutoversity website, which uses translations from the official Naruto databook for the most part. Yet for some reason I've never been able to substantiate this claim. There isn't a single statement in Naruto that says that the clones are equal in strength to the original. In fact, there are multiple statements saying the opposite, which I'm going to address in a sec, but I do understand how everyone came to this conclusion. The ability itself is stated to evenly distribute chakra between the clones and the original. They also have the same abilities as Naruto himself. They think the same, fight the same, and even look the same. The manga also makes it a point to have them fight on par with the original Naruto, operating with the same speed for combination attacks and seemingly exert similar levels of force to what Naruto is capable of doing by himself. So by every visual indicator, the Shadow Clone should be equal to the original in more than just chakra quantity. Now there are multiple layers to this, which makes the Shadow Clone Jutsu a tad bit paradoxical in nature, and I'm going to address those point by point, so bear with me for a minute. You see, there are two ways to interpret Naruto's Shadow Clones being equal to the original. For example, let's say Naruto creates two Shadow Clones. Since the ability requires that the chakra of the user is evenly distributed between each of them, Naruto and his clones would each have 1/3 of Naruto's chakra. So in one interpretation, Naruto's clones would be equal in pretty much everything to the current version of the real Naruto, who only has 1/3 of his original power. So the clones are equal to Naruto, just a weaker version of him. Now this second interpretation dictates that even though Naruto separated his chakra into thirds, his original physical stats weren't affected, just the amount of chakra he possessed. So Naruto himself didn't get physically weaker after dividing his chakra, which also means that the Shadow Clones retained those physical stats as well. So to simplify this, in one instance, less chakra doesn't equate to a decline in physical stats for the original Naruto or the clones he created, while in the first interpretation, the separation of chakra does equate to an equivalent amount of decrease in stats across the board. Now the funny thing about this is that there's ample evidence validating both interpretations. For one, Naruto himself doesn't move slower, nor does his punches get weaker no matter the amount of Shadow Clones he creates. He's still just as physically effective against his opponents, regardless of whether his clones range from 100 to 1000. This is shown multiple times in his fight versus Sasuke on the rooftop, later on in the final valley, his fight versus Gaara, and even his battle versus Kimimaro. This also extends to the untold amount of clones he created to send to every battlefield in the war. Naruto wasn't portrayed as physically weaker than he should be in his fight versus Obito, and neither was his clones that were combating Kage level opponents despite having hundreds, if not 1,000 clones spread across the world. Which, by the way, under the interpretation that less chakra equals to less physical stats, Naruto at multiple points in the manga was operating at 1/1000th of his original stats, while at the same time outputting similar force to Naruto before he divided his chakra. This, of course, doesn't make sense, right? So dividing chakra among your shadow clones clearly doesn't reduce the user's physical stats by an equivalent amount, which also means that chakra doesn't determine physical stats. Now I know that this might sound crazy since chakra is used to increase physical stats such as speed, strength, durability, etc., but it's a bit more complicated. You see, it was explained in part 1 that chakra is created by using one's mental and physical energy, which is described as stamina. This is also what's used to power taijutsu, which is pretty much anything having to do with physical movement and output, such as physical speed or striking strength. In fact, it outright states that taijutsu does not require chakra, outside of a few exceptions, which is likely body flicker and 8 gates. So in essence, chakra amount or quantity doesn't and has never determined physical stats. That's controlled by your stamina, which can also be used to create chakra. This would only make sense if the opposite were true. Naruto would have been the strongest character in the mangas since part 1, yet Sasuke and even Choji was confirmed physically stronger than him at varying points in the series. The same applies to Kisame, who has chakra levels rivaling the Biju, while still being weaker than the characters with less chakra, or even Kaguya being weaker than Ishiki despite having more chakra as it pertains to quantity. This of course is all possible since chakra quantity not only is it the main contributor to physical stats, it also doesn't increase stats directly proportional to the amount of it that exists. Now there's a caveat because, as I said, there's also evidence suggesting that creating a shadow clone does make Naruto weaker. Yes, despite everything I just laid out pointing to this not being the case, there's evidence suggesting otherwise to some extent. You see, back in chapter 319, while training to master wind chakra, Naruto suggested creating more shadow clones to speed up the process. That's because these shadow clones also have a function which allows them to send a current experience back to the caster. So if Naruto and his clones perform the same training exercise for the same amount of time, that would reduce his training time proportional to the amount of clones he created. That means one clone would halve the training time, 2 clones would only take a third of the time, etc. Do the math. Now this is important because in response to Naruto asking if he should create more clones, Kakashi says that what he needs is to transform a massive amount of chakra into wind to cut the waterfall. If you make too many clones, each one's chakra will be that much weaker. So not only does this imply that Naruto's chakra gets weaker the more clones he creates, it also confirms that the decline in potency is proportional to the quantity of clones. That is why he says that much weaker. That's the qualifier, the amount of clones. So similar to how one clone of Naruto halves his training time due to the compounding experience, a single clone also halves the overall potency of Naruto's chakra. This also lines up to what Kakashi said in the war as well, when Naruto made gestures to spawn a shadow clone. He told him that it would be meaningless to create a shadow clone that would split up your chakra. They might be useful as diversions, but not for decisive hits. This implies that Naruto's clones are a decline in strength and even power compared to the original, thus not being able to land a decisive blow. They simply aren't strong enough. Now there are 2 ways to interpret this statement. One is that they aren't able to land decisive hits as it pertains to ninjutsu, since each one's chakra is progressively weaker. This doesn't affect their physical stats, which is powered by the user's stamina, thus still being physically as strong as the original Naruto, which would align with the more substantiated interpretation. Now, the second way to interpret this is to say that it's a decrease in stats across the board because it didn't specify. Another point that supports this is that shadow clones are shown to be less durable than the original. That is why they get popped with varying degrees of contact, sometimes with a small amount of contact, and other times a clone remains intact after getting a direct strike to the heart for multiple seconds and even hold a Chidori in its chest long enough for the original to counter. So one could use this to supplement the idea that clones are physically weaker than the original, but I beg to differ. You see, the reason why the clones pop due to varying degrees of contact at different points in the series, which is very important, isn't necessarily because they're weaker. It has more to do with the mechanical weakness of the ability. This wasn't mentioned before, but shadow clones require more than just an equal amount of chakra when initially created. The user also has to maintain a constant stream of chakra to them at all times. That's because the clones become unstable when chakra isn't evenly distributed between all of them, which can cause them to disperse. So the ability has an inbuilt mechanic which forces the user to continuously maintain that balance at all times. This is also why Kakashi, why did I say Kakashi? Kakashi, whatever. This is why Kakashi isn't able to exploit the Shadow Clone training like Naruto does. As he himself said in chapter 315, I believe, while he can use Shadow Clone jutsus just like Naruto, he can't maintain them long enough because he simply doesn't have the kind of power Naruto does. He doesn't have a lot of chakra. Now, the reason why this is important to the durability point is because physical impact disrupts the balance of chakra within a Shadow Clone, which is what causes them to disperse, not because they're weaker per se. It's more so a nerf or a con of the ability, which prevents it from being overpowered. So the more clones one creates, the more bodies they have to continuously maintain, which not just inflicts strain on one's chakra reserves, but also mental bandwidth. That is why Mr. Naruto can selectively determine what level of damage his clones can endure at different points in the manga. It isn't about them getting stronger, it's Naruto making a conscious effort to make them that way on a need-to-use basis. Cue Itachi's line about every jutsu having a weakness, and there you have it. I could argue all day about how this doesn't make sense according to Newton's third law, which states that every action, there's an equal but opposite reaction, which would inherently scale striking strength proportional to durability. That means that if Naruto's clones get dispersed by a certain level of received contact, they should also get dispersed if they themselves exert that same amount of force. Though of course this is fiction and certain liberties are taken when it comes to logic, especially when taking into account weaknesses of abilities. Like, why is lightning weak to wind? Why does Damon need to touch someone to reflect attacks? Well, because the writer wanted it to be that way, it's all arbitrary. Now, based on everything I laid out in this video, I think the truth about the Shadow Clones is somewhere in the middle. Naruto himself doesn't get physically weaker when he produces clones, and neither do the clones themselves. But Naruto's chakra itself does get weaker each time he separates it. So it's not just a declining quantity, but also quality or potency. This would in essence mean that while Naruto's normal physical stats, which is powered by stamina, doesn't decline when he uses a Shadow Clone, the potency of his chakra does, which also applies to the clones as well. So this would in turn affect the strength of his, let's say, ninjutsu abilities or any taijutsu powered by chakra. That would also then explain why Mr. Tobirama said that a Shadow Clone's Flying Thunder God is too slow, because Flying Thunder God is a ninjutsu which is powered by chakra. So having less potent chakra by dividing that with your Shadow Clone affects the speed at which one can activate Flying Thunder God. This would also explain why Tobirama combining his chakra with Minato's increased the speed at which they could activate Flying Thunder God, because merging two chakras together would obviously increase the potency. With that said, there are some issues I have with the Shadow Clone Jutsu because, as I said before, Shadow Clones are maintained due to a mechanic built into the ability itself which forces the user to maintain a constant flow of chakra between them. That is what prevents them from getting dispersed when they use a jutsu that reduces the amount of chakra they initially received, which would naturally make the chakra amount between them and the original uneven. This, by the way, is why the multi-Shadow Clone Jutsu is a forbidden jutsu, because there were some accidental meetings with Shinobi Jesus in the Pure Lands because they unknowingly exhausted too much chakra maintaining multiple clones. Also, just to clarify, the multi-Shadow Clone Jutsu is the same as the Shadow Clone Jutsu. Same hand signs, same principle, everything is the same. So the Shadow Clone Jutsu itself isn't forbidden, it's just the process of creating multiple clones. And by process I mean you literally just wanting to create more than just a single clone. So it's not two separate jutsus, you're just forbidden from creating more than just a single Shadow Clone. Now, the point I was trying to make before that slight tangent is that Naruto's clone that was battling the right Kage and Edo Madara was somehow low on chakra, to the point that it was going to disperse because of course his chakra is no longer even, which is a bit weird since his chakra should have been equalized with the original automatically, but for some reason it wasn't. So I thought about it and my only answer was that maybe original Naruto was too far away to maintain the connection, which could make sense. But then you have this same clone receiving extra chakra from Kurama that's inside the original Naruto. That is how this Shadow Clone was able to create multiple clones of his own with multiple giant Rasengans. So how is Kurama able to transmit chakra to clones miles away from the original but Naruto himself couldn't? Who knows, maybe Kurama is just more skilled, that could simply be the answer. There's also another thing I found very interesting, which is that Obito stated that Naruto's clone chakra wouldn't be enough to peer into Kaguya's dimensions, but Sakura's was. And yes, Sakura at this point had the Byakugo seal, which had been storing chakra, bits of her chakra, for over 3 years, but she did use a lot of it over the course of the war, yet for some reason, she had more chakra than a single clone of Naruto, which not only had half of Naruto's chakra, which by itself was stated to be 4 times Kakashi's, but also half of the 9 tails, which is at a minimum 100 times Kakashi's. He also had chakra from all the 9 Biju or the 8 Biju, aside from Kurama, and even chakra from Hagoromo, combined with nature energy. That is why the Shadow Clone can also enter 6-path Sage mode. It has access to all the chakra Naruto himself does, which is remotely transmitted to it. So what you're telling me and expecting me to believe is that Sakura with the Byakugo seal has more chakra than half the 9 tails, bits of the Biju, and everyone else I mentioned. That's crazy. It could be true, but that's crazy. With that said, that's it for the video. If you guys liked it, drop a like down below, and if you're new, subscribe. And also, if you guys have any contentions, drop it in the comment section. I'll more than happily reply to you, and we can have a conversation and a discussion. But yeah, I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace out.